Empathy does not always begin as a moral choice or a natural virtue. For many people, it begins as a response to uncertainty. In childhood, the brain is not concerned with philosophy or character. It is concerned with safety. When a child grows up in an environment where emotions are unpredictable, where love is inconsistent, or where tension fills the space between words, the nervous system adapts. The child learns to pay attention, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. In such environments, emotional signals carry weight. A raised voice, a tightened jaw, a sudden silence. These cues can mean comfort or danger. Over time, the child's attention becomes finely tuned to these signals. This is not empathy as kindness, it is empathy as vigilance. The mind learns to scan constantly, to notice subtle changes in mood, posture, and tone. What looks like emotional intelligence later in life often began as emotional alertness. Neuroscience helps us understand this process. Repeated exposure to emotional stress strengthens neural pathways associated with threat detection and emotional monitoring. The brain becomes efficient at reading others because it has practiced relentlessly. This efficiency is adaptive in childhood. It helps the child anticipate conflict, avoid punishment, or earn approval. In short, it helps the child survive. The problem arises when this survival strategy follows the person into adulthood without being updated. The empath continues to read others first, even when no real threat exists. They feel responsible for emotional climates that are not theirs to manage. Their attention remains outward-facing, constantly assessing how others feel, often at the expense of their own inner signals. This is why many empaths struggle to identify their own needs. The skill that once protected them, attunement to others, crowded out attunement to self. The brain learned that noticing others was rewarded with safety or connection, while noticing oneself was irrelevant or even dangerous. Over time, this pattern feels natural, even virtuous. From the outside, such individuals appear exceptionally caring. They listen well, respond thoughtfully, and anticipate emotional needs. But internally, this can be accompanied by chronic tension and fatigue. Empathy, when rooted in survival, is rarely calm. It is alert, watchful, and difficult to turn off. Understanding empathy in this way reframes it. It is not merely a personality trait. It is a learned adaptation shaped by early emotional conditions. And like all adaptations, it can be reshaped. When empaths recognize that their sensitivity was once a form of self-protection, they gain the freedom to evolve it. Empathy can remain a strength, but it no longer needs to be driven by fear. It can become intentional, balanced, and grounded, an expression of emotional intelligence rather than a relic of emotional survival. When a child repeatedly learns that their own needs create discomfort, conflict, or rejection, a quiet internal shift takes place. The child does not think in terms of self-worth or boundaries. Instead, the brain draws a simple conclusion: expressing personal needs is unsafe. Over time, the child adapts by turning attention away from the self and toward others. This is not a conscious decision. It is a gradual, almost invisible form of self-abandonment shaped by experience. In many family systems, especially those marked by emotional volatility, neglect, or excessive control, children receive subtle messages about whose emotions matter most. They may be praised for being easy, mature, or understanding, while their sadness, anger, or fear is minimized or ignored. Each time the child suppresses a feeling to preserve harmony, the nervous system learns that suppression equals connection. The cost of that connection is authenticity. Psychologically, this pattern reinforces itself. Emotions that are not acknowledged do not disappear. They are simply pushed out of conscious awareness. The child becomes skilled at disconnecting from internal signals, hunger, fatigue, frustration, even joy, because responding to them was never rewarded. What remains is a heightened sensitivity to external cues, paired with a muted inner voice. As adulthood approaches, this early self-abandonment often shows up as confusion rather than pain. Many empaths struggle to answer basic questions. What do I want? What do I feel? What do I need right now? These questions were rarely asked of them as children, so the neural pathways for self-reflection were underdeveloped. Instead, the pathways for accommodating others became dominant. Daniel Goleman often emphasizes that emotional intelligence begins with self-awareness. Without it, empathy becomes lopsided. The individual may understand everyone else with remarkable clarity while remaining emotionally opaque to themselves. This imbalance can lead to chronic stress, resentment, or burnout, even in people who appear generous and well-adjusted. Self-abandonment also distorts the experience of responsibility. Empaths who learned early to ignore themselves often feel responsible for the emotions of others. If someone is disappointed, anxious, or angry, they instinctively search for what they did wrong. This reflex is rooted not in humility, but in conditioning. As children, managing others' emotions may have been the only way to maintain stability. Healing this pattern requires more than insight. It requires retraining attention. The empath must slowly learn to notice internal states without judgment and without urgency to fix anyone else. This is not selfishness, it is restoration. By reclaiming the parts of themselves that were set aside for survival, empaths move toward a more integrated form of emotional intelligence, one in which care for others is supported, not undermined, by care for the self. Hyper-awareness of others does not appear overnight. It is cultivated through repetition, attention, and emotional necessity. When a child grows up in an environment where moods shift quickly or consequences are unclear, the brain learns to gather information constantly. The child becomes a careful observer, not out of curiosity but out of caution. This heightened sensitivity to others' emotions becomes a way to anticipate what might happen next. Over time, this attentiveness grows increasingly refined. The child begins to notice patterns most people overlook: a pause before a response, a slight change in breathing, a tension in the shoulders. These signals are processed rapidly, often below conscious awareness. Neuroscience shows that repeated emotional monitoring strengthens the brain's limbic circuitry, making emotional perception faster and more automatic. What later looks like intuition is often the result of long practice. This form of awareness can be impressive. Empaths often excel in social situations because they detect unspoken dynamics. They sense when someone is uncomfortable, disengaged, or overwhelmed before a word is spoken. This ability can make them effective listeners, mediators, and caregivers. However, the origin of this skill matters. When hyper-awareness is driven by fear or responsibility rather than curiosity or care, it carries a cost. The constant outward focus leaves little room for inward attention. The empath's mind is habitually scanning the environment, asking silent questions. Is everything okay? Did I upset someone? Do I need to adjust? This vigilance keeps the nervous system slightly activated, even in safe settings. The body may relax momentarily, but the mind remains alert, ready to respond. Daniel Goleman describes emotional intelligence as the capacity to recognize emotions in ourselves and others, and to use that information wisely. Hyper-awareness, when unbalanced, reflects only half of this equation. The empath recognizes emotions in others with remarkable accuracy, but struggles to integrate that information with self-awareness and self-regulation. As a result, their responses may be quick but not always chosen. This pattern can also distort relationships. When one person is constantly attuned and adjusting, emotional reciprocity becomes uneven. The empath may feel deeply connected, while the other person remains unaware of how much emotional labor is being done on their behalf. Over time, this imbalance can lead to fatigue or quiet resentment. Importantly, hyper-awareness is not a flaw. It is an unfinished skill. It reflects a brain that learned to prioritize connection and safety through attention. The challenge in adulthood is to soften its urgency. When empaths learn to pause their scanning and redirect attention inward, something shifts. Awareness becomes less about control and more about understanding. With practice, hyper-awareness can evolve into presence. Instead of monitoring for threat, the empath begins to notice with openness. They still perceive subtle emotional cues, but they no longer feel compelled to manage them. In this way, a skill once rooted in vigilance becomes a capacity grounded in choice, balance, and genuine emotional intelligence. For many empaths, the simple act of setting a boundary triggers a disproportionate emotional response. Saying no can evoke guilt, anxiety, or an immediate urge to explain and justify. These reactions are rarely about the present situation. They are echoes from earlier learning. In childhood, boundaries may have been met with disappointment, withdrawal, or anger. Over time, the nervous system learned to associate self-protection with relational risk. As adults, this conditioning surfaces in subtle ways. Empaths often overextend themselves not because they lack awareness, but because rest and refusal feel morally wrong. They may interpret exhaustion as a personal failure rather than a biological signal. Even when they recognize the need for limits, acting on that recognition can feel emotionally unsafe. The body responds as if connection is once again at stake. Daniel Goleman's work emphasizes that self-regulation is central to emotional intelligence. Yet self-regulation requires permission to notice and honor internal states. When guilt interrupts this process, regulation becomes difficult. The empath may sense fatigue or resentment but override it to preserve harmony. This repeated override trains the brain to distrust its own signals. Guilt around boundaries often stems from an inflated sense of responsibility. Empaths may feel accountable for how others feel, believing that disappointment or discomfort is something they must prevent. This belief is not innate, it is learned. As children, they may have been praised for being accommodating or blamed for emotional disruptions. Over time, emotional responsibility became fused with self-worth. The result is a pattern of chronic self-monitoring. Before resting, the empath asks whether it is deserved. Before declining a request, they anticipate how it will be received. This constant evaluation consumes mental energy and contributes to stress. Research on emotional labor shows that managing others' feelings, especially without reciprocity, is strongly linked to burnout and emotional exhaustion. Importantly, guilt is not a reliable guide. It reflects past conditioning more than present reality. Healthy boundaries, when communicated calmly and consistently, do not damage relationships. They clarify them. But for the empath, learning this requires experience, not just insight. Each boundary set without catastrophe gradually retrains the nervous system. Goleman often notes that emotional intelligence grows through practice and feedback. In this context, the practice is small acts of self-respect. Saying no without over-explaining. Resting without apology. Allowing others to manage their own reactions. These actions may feel uncomfortable at first, but discomfort is not danger. Over time, guilt begins to soften. The empath learns that boundaries do not reduce empathy, they preserve it. When emotional energy is not constantly depleted, compassion becomes steadier and more authentic. In this way, learning to tolerate the guilt of self-care becomes a critical step toward mature emotional intelligence, one where kindness is sustainable because it includes the self. Relationships rarely form at random. They are shaped by familiar emotional patterns, often established long before conscious choice is possible. For many empaths, one of the most persistent patterns is a pull toward relationships that are emotionally uneven. They find themselves giving more, listening more, accommodating more, while receiving less in return. This imbalance is not accidental. It reflects what feels normal to the nervous system. From early life, empaths may have learned that connection is maintained through effort. Love was something to be earned by understanding, anticipating, and meeting the needs of others. As adults, this learning quietly guides attraction. People who are emotionally demanding, self-focused, or inconsistent often feel strangely compelling, not because they are healthy, but because they activate a familiar role. Daniel Goleman's work on social intelligence highlights how emotional patterns shape interpersonal dynamics. When one person is highly attuned and the other is not, a subtle asymmetry develops. The empath becomes the regulator of the relationship's emotional balance, while the other person benefits from this regulation without needing to develop it themselves. Over time, this dynamic can resemble a feedback loop. The more one gives, the less the other is required to notice. Individuals with narcissistic traits often fit easily into this pattern. They may be charismatic, expressive, or emotionally intense, drawing the empath in. Early on, the empath's sensitivity is rewarded with moments of closeness or validation. But these moments are often conditional and short-lived. The empath responds by trying harder. believing that deeper understanding or greater patience will restore connection. This dynamic is emotionally taxing. The empath invests energy without sufficient return, leading to confusion and self-doubt. When needs go unmet, they may assume they have failed to communicate clearly or care enough. The idea that the relationship itself is unbalanced can be difficult to accept because it challenges the empath's deeply held belief that effort creates closeness. Psychologically, this pattern is reinforced by intermittent reinforcement, periods of warmth followed by withdrawal. Research shows that such unpredictability strengthens attachment, even when the relationship is unsatisfying. For empaths, this mirrors early experiences where attention or affection was inconsistent. The brain mistakes familiarity for safety. Breaking this cycle requires a shift in emotional criteria. Instead of asking, "How much can I understand or tolerate?" the empath must begin asking, "How does this relationship make me feel over time?" Goleman emphasizes that emotional intelligence involves using emotional information wisely. Chronic depletion is information, not a flaw. As empaths learn to value reciprocity, attraction begins to change. Relationships grounded in mutual awareness may initially feel less intense, but they are more stabilizing. The empath no longer has to perform emotional labor to be seen. In this way, recognizing and stepping out of one-sided dynamics becomes not a loss of empathy, but an expression of it, directed at last toward the self. For many empaths, the idea of being selfish carries moral weight. It is associated with harm, neglect, or emotional coldness. Yet this association is often inherited from early environments where prioritizing oneself disrupted fragile emotional systems. In adulthood, redefining selfishness becomes essential. What is often labeled selfish is, in fact, self-respect, a foundational element of emotional intelligence. Daniel Goleman emphasizes that emotional intelligence is not about suppressing emotions or endlessly accommodating others. It is about awareness, choice, and regulation. Healthy self-interest begins with self-awareness. Empaths must learn to notice their own emotional states with the same attentiveness they offer others. This noticing is not indulgent. It provides critical information about limits, values, and capacity. Boundaries emerge naturally from this awareness. When an empath recognizes fatigue, resentment, or disengagement, these signals are not signs of failure. They are data. Acting on that data by resting, declining, or renegotiating is an intelligent response. Without boundaries, empathy becomes reactive and draining. With boundaries, it becomes deliberate and sustainable. This shift requires retraining long-standing habits. Many empaths are accustomed to acting before reflecting, offering help before being asked, or absorbing emotional distress without pause. Slowing down interrupts these reflexes. A brief moment of reflection, what do I need right now? What is mine to carry and what is not? Creates space for choice. Over time, this pause becomes a new pattern. Importantly, self-respect does not diminish compassion. Research in psychology consistently shows that people who maintain clear boundaries experience less burnout and greater emotional availability. When empaths protect their energy, their capacity to care becomes more stable. They are less likely to give out of guilt and more likely to give out of genuine concern. Goleman often notes that mature emotional intelligence integrates multiple competencies. Empathy without self-regulation leads to exhaustion. Self-awareness without empathy leads to isolation. Healthy selfishness bridges these skills. It allows the empath to remain connected without becoming consumed. As empaths practice this form of self-care, their relationships begin to change. They communicate more directly. They tolerate discomfort when others are disappointed. They allow space for mutual responsibility. These changes may initially feel unsettling, but they signal growth. Emotional systems reorganize around clarity rather than sacrifice. Ultimately, healing does not require empaths to become less sensitive. It requires them to become more whole. When empathy is balanced with self-respect, it no longer functions as a survival strategy. It becomes a choice aligned with values and capacity. In this state, caring for oneself is no longer opposed to caring for others. It is the condition that makes genuine empathy possible, grounded, resilient, and free from self-erasure.